Now back to Morningline. Here's Steve Helms.
And welcome back, folks, and thank you for joining us. And we should be talking with our guest from the Show Me Institute, Patrick Ishmael. And one of the topics that we'll be talking about is the downtown Springfield. There is a quarter-cent sales tax that is going to be placed on a ballot for those who live within that district, and it's going to go for public safety and other items. And so, it's a way of taxing an area to raise funds. And so, as usually, the Show Me Institute have a particular perspective that they're going to share with us on the merits of the issue. And so I want to welcome Patrick Ishmael. Good morning, sir, and thank you for joining us.
Hey, good morning. How are you?
Oh, you're very welcome. And we just started to talk about that quarter-cent sales tax, and you're the guy. You folks delve into these issues and know what's going on. So share with us, what are your thoughts on that sales tax in Springfield?
Sure. Well, the CID is considering raising the sales tax by a quarter cent to hire at least one officer, and also to I think just provide better coverage in the district, because I think it's growing. And when you start talking about raising taxes, obviously our antenna go up a little bit. But when you do it in the context of a CID, there has to be a little bit of a concern, a little bit of a pause, because a lot of times what ends up happening is the local district ends up paying for things that the city ought to be paying for directly. And so when you start talking about public safety, it is a little bit of a concern that the local district has to add more effort to it, because if you are paying for police protection, having to pay additional for the police protection that you were expecting or would expect to be fully secure in your property is really a problem. And the result being is that the city ends up kind of getting to double dip indirectly, because they get to get your public safety dollars on the front end, but they also don't have to pay to adequately cover your district with the public safety that you might think that you need. And so you end up getting higher taxes for essentially the same sort of services that you expect. And as a general matter, that's kind of bad public policy. And there is this tension philosophically, because you do want to have greater local control. You want to, if you want something more, you want to be able to spend more for that thing. In this case, it's public safety. But it does create this quandary where the city can end up not doing fully its job or providing the protection that you'd want, and forcing local residents to spend more for things that are really an appropriate place for the city government to come in and take care of business, I think is not great news short term, and can be really bad news long term.
One of the complaints I guess I've heard about the CIDs is that they are often it's hard for the consumer, when they go into an area, to know where what their true cost, and most people just don't look at the sales tax portion because they think it's all the same.
Yeah, you can have some pretty drastic changes in sales taxes as you move from district to district in any given city. In Kansas City, there's a district where sales taxes are about 13%.
Wow!
And that's because you have a bunch of overlapping districts on top of one another. But the end result is for folks who aren't aware that the district has some several layers of taxes, they end up going in, spending their money, and then maybe they won't notice it, but if they do take a look at their receipt, it is really expensive. In fact, in Kansas City has some of the highest sales taxes in the country because they have so many local districts that levy special taxes. And a lot of times when that happens, sometimes it's a matter of the city just not doing its job. A lot of times that's what it's a symptom of, is that the local districts themselves feel like they have to raise these taxes because the city isn't providing the services that they're supposed to. And that's a bad situation to be in for a lot of reasons, but not least of which being is that if you're a resident, you're paying it on the front side and you're paying on the back side for the same level of services that you ought to be expecting just from the front side spending.
I guess when the arguments that I've heard from those who want to raise the tax, and not necessarily CID, but with on the city side, and not talking about Springfield in particular, but if you talk about any of these other ones, is that they just say, well, we don't have any money and we're doing the best we can with what we have. And then so it kind of devolves into then maybe the local entity feels that they need that to keep their area going along, in particular since this is downtown.
Yeah, and I think that's an understandable reaction. My understanding with Springfield, though, is that they're still spending the surplus they had from last year. In fact, I think sales tax revenue for the coming year they expect to be about 7% higher, and so. And this isn't, I'm intending to say, well, Springfield is flush with money and they ought to just spend it all. But it does seem like there ought to be money in the budget, regardless whether money is, ramping up or whether it's, puttering along as expected. There ought to be money in the budget for public safety, adequate public safety. And if the CID districts, if they want to add cops, I think we can all understand that. But they do have to keep in mind that those are really places where those services should be provided by the city themselves. And if they do add these new taxes, it is going to mean higher taxes for residents, obviously. And the question is that going to make the district less competitive over time? A quarter cent here, a half cent here, really adds up. You're talking about serious money over time, and the concern isn't necessarily about just this tax proposal, because it is a concern, but it's the general strategy of saying, well, we're just going to keep on layering local taxes on, and that's how we're going to pay for this. I think you really do have to hold city government responsible and say, this is your job. You're supposed to be providing adequate public safety for, not just our district, but for the entire city. Why aren't you doing it?
It's kind of tough sometimes, when you talk about the ballot box and elections, if someone doesn't do a job, if you're an employer and you have an employee and they don't do a job, it's easy to pinpoint the issue and the problem and, find someone who can do the job. And it just seems like within the political realm, that's a whole lot tougher to do than it should be, it seems like.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. It's one of the reasons why you really don't want to empower government to do much beyond what its core competencies and services are. I mean, a lot of city governments will go out and say, we want to be an investor. We want to create a really fancy entertainment district, just kind of be a venture capitalist. And a lot of times what ends up happening is those districts will fail or those projects will fail. And by that time, the folks who, got that in motion, they're out of office. In a private sector context, those folks, if they were still employed, would probably be fired. But there aren't necessarily a lot of consequences for bad behavior, or at least bad decision-making, when you're talking about a government context. It's always fun to go out and cut the ribbon, but it's not so fun to realize that you just blew millions of taxpayer dollars. And that's why it's so important to rely on the free market. I mean, the Show Me Institute is a free market think tank. And when we talk about free markets, I think it's very easy to forget exactly what we're talking about. When we talk about free markets, believing in free markets, we're talking about believing in people. And if you want to make sure that the best decisions are being made, as a general matter, you want to make sure that people are empowered to use their money and invest their money easily, that you support them doing that rather than having the government intervene and mess with that. But it's a very moral argument, because what you're saying is that I believe in the individuals rather than trying to say I believe in government to, kind of without particular consequence to people making the decisions, make decisions on our behalf. It's important to make sure that the individual is empowered, not the government. And like you say, if you want to make sure that people are held accountable, for the most part, you really want to make sure that the market is the main mover in a lot of these questions. And unfortunately, I think the government places itself in the center way too often.
And when you talk about the market, and you answered a question that I was going to ask next, is how do they how do entities become efficient? And I think you answered it by saying, they don't do things they're not good at. That's the first step. But when you talk about the market, I think a lot of people think, well, when you talk about a fair wage, all these, in New York, I think of rent controls and things like that. It would be nice, and people get mad when someone's ripping them off, but the market will determine the price regardless of what government tries, at least from my perspective. I think of Venezuela. They tried to command and control the economy, and it failed. And the more government tries to get in that mix of dictating how things are, the prices of this or that, the market ultimately determines what some value is, regardless of what we inherently think it ought to be.
Yeah, and Venezuela is a great example and a terrible tragedy, because that's a country that is, built on top of an oil field practically. There is no reason why you should have people starving in Venezuela. Why they can't find toilet paper? Why they can't find, food? And that is, everybody wants to. Or I think most everybody wants to do good by their peers. I think they want to be liked. I think they want to help. But unfortunately, a lot of times what ends up happening is we start, if you're talking about political actors, going beyond exactly what our competencies are. And you end up having a lot of unintended consequences. I think starvation is an unintended consequence. And the reason that you end up finding yourself there in the case of Venezuela is because you end up having this command economy, this centrally controlled economy, when really you should be trusting individuals. You should be trusting the people to be able to make the country better. And there are vested interests individually. Like, you want to make sure that your family is better off. You're going to make efficient decisions because you don't have, and I don't have, an unlimited amount of money. And that's what makes markets work, is that people are trying to preserve capital. Unfortunately, that's not really what government does, and it's not certainly what government does very well. And when you have this, when the cap comes off and government spending and government control, goes just through the roof, you have to have controls in place. You have got to not disempower individuals. And in that process, I think you're simply better off saying, well, we'll trust the market. We'll have a market-based economy. The money will be generally spent efficiently because it's people who have a vested interest in it. And the government will stick to the things that it is more competent at, which is, build roads, public safety. And that's pretty much it. And that's how it ought to be. When you start moving beyond those bounds, that's when you get into serious trouble.
And so, again, to me, that answers the question: is how do you get there? How do you get government to focus on the issues when you have all these wants and needs of special interests throwing them in the pot?
Well, I think it really comes down to the public holding them accountable. That really means that you have to be engaged in your politics. And whichever way you engage, that really is not any of my place. But being active participants in the political process, being active participants in our democracy is hugely important. And it's the only way that any positive change is ever really going to come out of it. It's people who care about their city and their state and their country. Those are the people who matter the most. And if they end up being absent for whatever the reason, our democracy is hurt by it.
Well, we certainly appreciate you and the Show Me Institute for bringing this issue up and for the ideas that you bring to the table.
Well, thank you so much.
And anything that you're looking on in the future? Ideas, topics?
We're working on projects all the time. We have an education project that several papers coming up. We have a paper on interstate licensing. Check out our website, showmeinstitute.org.
Very good. And that is Patrick Ishmael with the Show Me Institute, and we appreciate his time. And folks, that's the whole idea. Get involved in the system. Regardless of what side you're on or what views you have, the important thing is that we work together to find the best ideas, and hopefully they will float to the top.